Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something I think many of you will have some kind of connection to short-term missions, or STMs.
Right. It's a huge area. Globally, you're looking at maybe 2 million people heading out on these things every year.
It's staggering.
Yeah.
And just to give a sense of the scale, here in the U.S., think back to 2005, an incredible 1.6 million church members traveled abroad for STM.
1.6 million, yeah. And then you add on top of that.
Exactly. Another 500,000 to maybe 1 million traveling domestically each year around that same time.
And we know that doesn't even cover everyone, right?
Yeah.
All the other groups, plus numbers are growing from other countries too.
Absolutely. So chances are, if you're listening, you've probably been on one or sent someone, maybe even hosted a team.
It really is a massive movement. All that energy, all those resources being put out there.
Which brings us to the core question, really.
Yeah. How do we make sure these short-term efforts actually feed into something bigger, something long-term? What people often call the Missio Dei, the mission of God.
Instead of becoming, well, like you said, maybe less effective. Kind of Missio me.
Precisely. That tension, that's really what we need to dig into today.
Yeah. Okay. And to guide us, we're drawing on insights from Roger Peterson. He's the executive director of STEM International, and he also chairs the Alliance for Excellence in Short-Term Mission. So he's deep in this world.
He really is. His piece, Missio Dei, or Missio Me, tackles this head-on.
Great. So, okay, let's get down to brass tacks first.
Yeah.
What exactly are we even talking about when we say short-term mission today? Because it feels like that definition has really changed quite a bit.
That's a critical starting point. It wasn't that long ago if someone said short-term mission, they probably meant like a 2 to 4 year commitment serving overseas.
Wow, yeah, 2 to 4 years. Very different.
Completely different picture now. Today, it could be anything from a youth group spending a weekend just, across the border to a church doing a one-day project right in their own city.
That's a massive range
Yeah.
in scale, in commitment. And it's not just the length of time that's different, is it? It's also who's sort of defining these things.
Exactly. It used to be the traditional mission agencies mostly set the terms, but now Peterson estimates there could be like 350,000 individual local churches just in the U.S.
350,000. Wow.
Yeah, and each one might be operating with its own definition, its own approach, which, leads to a lot of variety, but sometimes maybe a lack of coordination too.
Right. So Peterson doesn't give a strict definition then, more like descriptive words.
That's it. He uses terms like swift, temporary, and voluntary, which paints a pretty clear picture, I think.
Swift, temporary, voluntary. Okay,
Yeah.
So rapid mobilization, shorter time frames, usually volunteers.
Yeah.
Quite different from, say, career missionaries.
Very different. But let's circle back to that word mission and all this. That's key.
Right, the mission part of STM.
Peterson argues that often the mission part gets understood just as the immediate good works the team does, helping people, acts of compassion.
Which are good things, obviously.
Of course.
Yeah.
Very important. But he argues a better way, a more effective way to think about and evaluate STMs is to ask, how well does this specific effort actually align with God's bigger overarching mission in the world, the Missio Dei?
That makes sense. That becomes the yardstick then.
That's the crucial yardstick, yeah.
Okay, that gives us a solid framework.
Yeah.
Now, Peterson lays out what he calls 4 medium-resolution snapshots of the STM landscape today. Let's walk through those. First up, where are these missions actually going? Has that changed?
It's really interesting, actually. There was a major shift, it seems, after Hurricane Katrina back in 2005.
Ah, okay. How so?
Well, before Katrina, the data suggests that for U.S.-based STMs, it was roughly, a third going international, a third staying domestic U.S. or Canada, and about a third going to Mexico.
Okay, fairly evenly split 3 ways.
Pretty much. But after Katrina, things changed quite a bit. The international bit stayed around a third, roughly.
All right.
But domestic trips jumped up to about half of all STMs, and trips to Mexico dropped way down, maybe only about a sixth.
Wow, so a huge shift towards domestic needs after Katrina. That makes intuitive sense, I suppose. A major crisis right here.
Exactly. A significant reprioritization happened in response to that immediate, large-scale need at home.
Okay, snapshot number 2. Who are these missions actually serving? This feels pretty important for understanding impact.
It is, yeah. It's quite revealing. Peterson points out, and this is a big one, that the vast majority, we're talking at least 4 out of every 5 short-termers,
4 out of 5, okay.
are going to communities that are already churched or what would be considered reached with the gospel.
So not necessarily the places with the least access to Christianity.
Generally, no. That leaves less than 1 in 5, under 20% going to those sort of frontier areas, to unreached or unengaged people groups. And he backs this up with research from Robert J. Priest, who found only about 13% of STMs go to countries in the 1040 window.
Which is often seen as a priority area for reaching the unreached.
Exactly. So a key takeaway here is that most STM work, the bulk of it, is happening among existing Christian communities, not necessarily on the frontiers of mission.
That's a really stark statistic. Really makes you think about resource allocation and where the needs might be greatest. Okay, the third snapshot is about effectiveness. And this sounds like, well, maybe a difficult area.
It is. Pearson himself calls it a fuzzy estimate, but it's a concerning one that you hear echoed across the missions world.
What's the estimate?
Roughly 3 out of every 4 STMs are thought to be done poorly.
3/4, wow. Leaving only 1 in 4 may be considered done well.
That's the estimation, yeah. It comes initially from Seth Barnes at Adventures in Missions, but Peterson says it's a view kind of widely held in the missions industry.
Now, done poorly, done well. Those are subjective, I imagine.
For sure, they aren't easily quantified with hard data, but the general consensus, the feeling within the community, points to a really significant need for improvement in how these things are planned and carried out.
75% potentially not hitting the mark. That really gives you pause.
It really does, especially when you consider the resources involved.
Which leads right into the fourth snapshot. The money, the financial side of this. With millions of people involved, the cost must be enormous.
It is. Peterson puts the figure at approximately $2 billion spent on STMs annually.
$2 billion a year.
Yep, a massive financial investment. And that number, $2 billion, it just really underscores why it's so important to ask these tough questions about effectiveness and long-term impact. Are we getting a true kingdom return on that investment?
$2 billion.
Yeah.
That really puts the scale under sharp perspective. Okay, so we've got a clearer picture of the landscape where people go, who they serve, effectiveness concerns, the huge financial investment. Now, Peterson digs into why. Why might so many STMs be done poorly? And crucially, how can we do better? His first point is about failing to connect with the Missio Dei.
Right, and this goes back to that core idea we started with, defining mission. Peterson argues that if you don't have a solid grasp of God's bigger, ongoing, global purpose, the work he's been doing throughout history everywhere, then mission itself can get kind of, trivialized.
How so?
It can become just about, people helping people in need, which is good, but it might miss that larger context of God's redemptive plan for the whole world.
So losing the theological depth.
Sort of. And there's a danger, he says, that short-termers, and maybe especially their leaders, get overly impressed with what they can achieve in a week or two, independently.
Right, focusing on the team's actions alone.
Yeah, without fully recognizing the vast ongoing work God is already doing in that place. And he makes a key point here. Often, these mistakes in design, in leadership, they start with the STM leaders, not necessarily the participants who just want to help.
That's an important clarification for anyone who's been on a trip. Okay, the second factor for STMs being done poorly is independent planning and action. This seems directly linked to not seeing that bigger picture.
It absolutely is. Peterson really hammers this point, the critical need for partnership.
Partnership with whom?
With experienced mission agencies, yes. But crucially, with the national and local churches and the communities being served.
The people who are there long term.
Exactly. They're the ones who will be there long after the team flies home, carrying on the work. He gives some pretty vivid examples of what happens when this partnership is missing.
Like what?
Well, imagine a pastor in Mexico whose small church building gets painted 6 different times in a single summer.
6 times? By different teams?
Yeah, by various well-meaning teams, none of them knowing about the others. Or the story of a team in Brazil that built a wall right across the middle of an orphanage's soccer field.
Why would they do that?
Because apparently their idea was STMs build walls. That's what they came to do, regardless of the actual need or context.
Oh, wow. So good intentions leading to, unhelpful or even harmful outcomes.
Precisely. These efforts, even when driven by a desire to help, can end up being inefficient, burdensome, or just plain disruptive if they're not plugged into the long-term vision and the real needs on the ground. If you're listening and you've organized trips, you might recognize some of those coordination headaches.
Those examples really drive it home. Understanding and coordination with locals is non-negotiable. Okay, third factor, prioritizing personal discipleship over the mission goal. That sounds subtle.
It can be, yeah. Peterson notes the language shift, how often we hear short-term mission trips now rather than just short-term missions.
Adding the word trips, what's the significance there?
Well, he suggests that little word might indicate a shift in focus, that maybe the primary goal for some has become the personal growth, the discipleship experience for the team members, rather than contributing to that larger Missio Dei.
But isn't personal growth a good outcome?
Oh, absolutely. Discipling team members is a fantastic byproduct of a well-run STM. But, Peterson argues, it shouldn't become the main thing, overshadowing the actual purpose of joining God's work in the world.
So it's about the primary focus.
Right. If the main aim is just to give participants a spiritual boost or a personal blessing, he uses a pretty stark analogy. It risks becoming just expensive jet lag.
Ouch. That's blunt.
It is, but it puts the focus back where he believes it should be. Personal growth is great, valuable even, but it shouldn't eclipse the mission itself.
Okay, that's a really important recalibration. The mission comes first. Personal growth is a welcome, but secondary outcome. Right, let's flip this around then. What makes for STMs done well? Peterson highlights factors here too. First, recognizing God's pre-existing mission.
Yeah, this is basically the positive side of that first pitfall we discussed. It's about understanding, deeply understanding, that when a team arrives somewhere, they are not starting the mission.
God's already there, already working.
Exactly. God is already actively at work in every nation among every people group. So the big responsibility for STM leaders is to, well, do their homework.
Learn about the context first.
Yes, learn what God is already doing there, and then prayerfully figure out how their short-term team can genuinely come alongside and support that ongoing work.
Which means connecting with people on the ground.
Absolutely. Building relationships with experienced folks, both short-term and long-term STM practitioners. Humbly seeking guidance on how to join in what God has already started. It's about joining his movement, not trying to launch your own.
That makes so much sense. Entering a story already in progress, not trying to write chapter 1 in a week. Okay, second key to success. Repenting of independence and embracing partnership. This sounds like the direct answer to those uncoordinated efforts.
It is. Peterson directly challenges that, maybe particularly Western, I can do it by myself mindset.
Right. The independent spirit.
Yeah. He argues for consciously setting aside our own plans, our own brilliant ideas sometimes, and subordinating them to God's bigger global plan worked out in partnership.
And how do you do that practically?
He specifically advises seeking wisdom from, quote, battle-scarred, seasoned mission agency leaders, people who've learned the hard way. And again, cultivating those vital links with the national churches and agencies that have the long-term presence, the cultural understanding.
It really comes down to humility, doesn't it? And a willingness to learn.
Huge amounts of humility and genuine collaboration. That's essential if the short-term effort is going to be truly supportive, sustainable, and, culturally appropriate.
Okay. The final factor for doing STMs well. Shifting from just tricks to true mission, but with accountability. How do we make that happen?
This is where Peterson gets really practical about intentionality and accountability structures. He's calling for a conscious move away from seeing these as just isolated trips or experiences.
Like spiritual tourism almost.
Potentially, yeah. And moving towards actively participating in short-term mission that demonstrably, you can actually see it, contributes to God's global work.
And how do you measure that? How do you hold people accountable?
He points directly to the U.S. standards of excellence in short-term mission.
Ah, okay. So there are actual standards.
Yes, a whole framework. They were developed collaboratively, involving over 400 STM leaders, apparently. And they provide a pretty robust system for accountability, including a peer review process every 3 years.
So it's not just good ideas. It's about concrete practices and evaluation.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond just good intentions to measurable standards for effective ethical mission work.
Can you give us a flavor of what those standards cover?
Sure. There are 7 main ones. First, God-centeredness, making sure it's all focused on his glory and kingdom.
Makes sense.
Second, empowering partnerships, those healthy, mutually beneficial relationships we talked about. Third, mutual design, planning things together so everyone benefits.
Okay.
Fourth is comprehensive administration, basically, being organized, reliable, managing things well. Fifth, qualified leadership, making sure leaders are properly screened, trained, and supported. Sixth, appropriate training for all the participants, so they're prepared. And finally, seventh, thorough follow-up debriefing, ongoing support for everyone involved, senders and receivers.
That sounds incredibly comprehensive.
It is, and Peterson strongly encourages anyone involved in STMs, planning them, leading them, funding them, to check these out. The websites are www.stmstandards.org, www.aestm.org, and www.fstml.org.
We'll make sure those links are available. So for you listening, those are real practical resources for evaluating and improving how STMs are done.
Definitely. They offer a concrete roadmap.
This gives us a really helpful picture then. The scale, the challenges, but also a clear path towards doing these things much better. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, what are the big takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the first thing is just recognizing the sheer potential here. The future holds massive opportunities for Christians everywhere to get involved, sending, going, hosting.
The movement isn't likely to shrink.
Probably not. So the critical thing is that shift in vision, really seeing these efforts as ways to genuinely contribute to God's big global purposes.
Not just isolated activities.
Right. Peterson urges everyone, actively seek out knowledge, learn what God is already doing from the people who have the long-term local experience. Ask them.
Be learners first.
Exactly. And then think creatively. What are the unique ways short-term volunteers can support and learn from those long-term efforts? Is it evangelism? Practical service, sharing specific skills, bringing relief? It's about finding that right fit.
Recognizing you're joining something bigger, something already in motion.
Yeah.
It sounds like the key ingredients are really intentionality, deep humility, and genuine partnership.
That sums it up beautifully. Intentionality, humility, partnership.
And that leads us, I suppose, to a final thought for everyone listening.
Yeah, maybe something to chew on. Consider how even small, short-term actions, things that seem temporary, how they can become a meaningful part of God's huge, unfolding story, his big story.
When they're done right, when they're aligned with his Missio Dei.
Precisely. So the question for you, the listener, might be, what unique door could be open for you, not just to take a trip, but to genuinely step into that bigger story and contribute to something lasting?